You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
My wife Mary Jane and I currently own a home that's about 4 miles or 6.4 kilometers east of the Hudson River. And I have to tell you, we cross this river quite a bit. And that's because my wife's job, most of the shopping, and the nearby cities of Albany, Schenectady, and Saratoga, they're all on the opposite side. Even the main highway that we use to get around is on the other side of the river. In fact, we cross the Hudson so often that most of the time we don't even pay attention to the fact that we're doing so. And unlike those who live downstate and much closer to New York City, we don't pay any tolls to get across the river. There are quite a few bridges in the area, and they're all free to use at any time. Of course, they're not exactly free. We do pay tax dollars, but I think you know what I mean. Anyway, the bridge that we use the most is also the one that we hate the most. It is known as the Troy-Menands Bridge, and it connects the southern portion of the city of Troy with the village of Menands, which is right across the river. So let me see if I can describe this bridge for you. Technically, it's a 4-span through-truss bridge that sits way above the river. I certainly wouldn't want to fall off of it. So picture 4 large sections of steel beams with diagonal beams that are riveted in for added strength. The 4-lane roadbed then travels through the central opening in this whole truss section. But one thing I'm sure of is that this bridge was never intended to handle the estimated 37,000 vehicles that cross it daily. As you can imagine, its lanes are narrow and it leads to frequent accidents. Adding to the problem is the bridge's old age. It was built during the Great Depression from 1928 through 1933, and it's in serious need of replacement. And I have to tell you, I've lived here for 34 years, and I swear the whole time I've lived here, they've been talking about replacing it. And supposedly within the next 10 years, they will do so. But it can't happen soon enough. The bridge is old and decrepit, and sometimes I worry about being one of the unlucky drivers who is crossing it when it collapses down into the Hudson River below. And while I suspect that the bridge is in far better shape than it appears, I can't shake those occasional disastrous thoughts. Well, the story that I have for you today is from the early 1950s, and it involves a trucker who worked for a firm that operated a distribution facility in the Menands regional market. And that market is still in existence today, although the business isn't, and it's located right at the foot of the Troy-Menands Bridge. Now, if you don't know where Menands is, don't worry about it. This is the kind of story that could have happened in any town, any city, any country. In other words, it could have happened anywhere. I even bet that something similar may have happened in your town once. Anyway, sit back and enjoy Lies in the Fast Lane. It's a story that begins on the tragic day that this trucker lost his life. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Now, before we dive into the story, I just want to mention that I'm getting over a mild case of COVID. Of all the people I know, I think I'm the last person to get it. Somehow I've pushed it off nearly 4 years, but I finally got it. And I'm fine, but I am a bit stuffed up. So I apologize in advance for the quality of my voice and for any gasping of air that you may hear as I tell this. Anyway, here we go. 30-year-old truck driver Eugene Wood had been working for the William C. Romaine Produce Trucking Company of Menands, New York for 3.5 years. So his scheduled run on Tuesday, September 30th of 1952 seemed entirely routine. His tractor-trailer was loaded with eggs, and then he set off to make 2 scheduled stops. The first was in Jersey City, New Jersey, and that was to be followed by a delivery out on Long Island. Eugene was expected to return to Menands the following afternoon. While he was driving along Route 17 through Paramus, New Jersey, a vehicle that was driven by 35-year-old Albert Masseau of New York City, it attempted to cut in front of Eugene. So Wood instinctively slammed on the truck's brakes. But in an error before seatbelts, Eugene was thrown from the cab and he landed right down on the roadbed. Sadly, he died almost instantaneously as his trailer jackknifed and landed right on top of him. Masseau, on the other hand, he escaped with just slight cuts. First, a little background. Eugene Harry Wood was born on January 18th of 1922 to Myrtle and Harry Wood of Kingston, New York. Eugene's obituary states that he was survived by his wife, 4 young children, his parents, his paternal grandfather, a brother, and 3 sisters. Eugene had met his future wife, that's the former Anna Houck, in a roller rink, and you certainly don't hear about people meeting there very often these days. Anyway, they were married in Catskill, New York by a justice of the peace on September 5th of 1941. Then, a few months later, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Eugene entered the military as a Navy Seabee. Upon completing his service, which from what I can piece together was mostly stateside, Eugene was granted an honorable discharge. At the time of his death, Eugene was the father to 10-year-old Linda Ann, 9-year-old Jean Dale, 5-year-old Harry Eugene, and 1-year-old Marcia Sue. The family, they had been living in the Ulster County town of Saugerties, New York, although I should point out that Eugene was hardly ever there. And that, of course, is due to the many hours he spent on the road driving his truck. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone days at a time, sometimes to be gone the entire week. Funeral services were held on October 4th of 1952 at the Gallietta Funeral Home in Saugerties, and then Eugene was buried in the nearby Blue Mountain Cemetery. Of course, that meant that 31-year-old Anna was suddenly a widow with no means of supporting her 4 children. And that left her with no choice but to sue the pants off the other vehicle's driver, Albert Massot. However, Eugene passed away without leaving a will, so Anna's lawyer requested that the Ulster County Circuit Court issue letters of administration to her. And of course, as Eugene's lawfully wedded wife, the judge granted the letters without any hesitation. But it wasn't long before a complication in the case arose. That's because letters of administration for Eugene Wood's estate had also been issued by Rensselaer County Surrogate Court Judge Edward J. Donahue, about 60 miles or 97 kilometers straight up the Hudson in Troy, New York. Just how Judge Donahue learned of this duplicity is unknown, but he quickly signed an order suspending the power of the limited letters that he had approved. So how could this possibly be? I mean, what is going on here? Well, it turns out the issue wasn't with the paperwork, it was with Eugene's marriage. And that's because he didn't have just one marriage, he had 2 marriages. He had 2 wives. Yes, Eugene was a bigamist. Now, we've already met wife number 1, Anna, who lives in Saugerties. Wife number 2 was Jean Patricelli, whom Wood married on January 24th, 1945, in the rectory of St. Joseph's Church in Albany. At the time of the second union, Eugene listed it as his first marriage. I think someone's telling a fib. He also listed his address as Camp Endicott in Rhode Island, which implies that he was still in the Navy at that time. And the newlyweds lived in various apartments in Albany, but ultimately moved to Scaghtikoke, New York, 6 months before his death. Scaghtikoke, which is spelled Schaghtikoke, is a small town located in the northern portion of Rensselaer County, which is how the case ended up before Judge Donahue in Troy. Troy being the county seat of Rensselaer County. And the reason that Jean Wood, wife number 2, sought letters of administration was the same as why wife number 1, Anna, had done the same. She planned to file a negligence suit against driver Albert Massot. So let's see if I can paint a visual map for you. The Hudson River runs from the Adirondacks in the north straight down, almost directly south to New York City and then out into the Atlantic Ocean. In regards to the locations pertinent to the story, the northernmost point is Scaghtikoke. Then as we move south, and we are moving along the eastern side of the Hudson River, along the eastern bank, as we move south, we get to Troy, maybe about a 20-25 minute drive. Then we hop across the river to the western bank, head south maybe about 15 minutes or so, we hit Menands, and keep driving south directly down the river, and we'll eventually hit Saugerties. Probably from Scaghtikoke to Saugerties back in 1952, since there were no highways, it probably took about an hour and a half to make that drive. Now, at first glance, this would seem like a clear-cut case. Anna married Eugene first, so his second marriage was illegal. But it wasn't that simple. That's because Wood didn't have just two wives, he also had two sets of children. Not only did he have 4 children with his first wife, Anna, but he was also raising 4 children with his most recent bride, Jean. So even if marriage number 2 was ultimately ruled null and void, the question arose as to whether the children born from that union, if they were entitled to a portion of Eugene's estate. The second Mrs. Wood had an 8-year-old child from a previous relationship, but Eugene definitely fathered the other 3. They were 3-year-old Eugene Jr. and 2-year-old twins Carol and Richard. And if that wasn't enough kids, get this, Jean was pregnant with her 5th child. There was another one on the way. William Romaine, Eugene's boss, said he was one of the hardest working drivers that he employed. And he noted that Eugene was always willing to take on an additional run. Of course, with 2 households, 2 wives, and 8 children to support, his willingness to put in some overtime, well, that should come as no surprise. Romaine said that Eugene would typically make 5 round trips each week from his terminal in Menands. Each run would take Eugene down to the New York City metropolitan area and, of course, back. And it's thought that he balances 2 lives by spending time with his first family in Saugerties while he's on those trips downstate, and then of course he'd stay with his second family in Schaghticoke after returning his truck to Romaine's facility in Menands. I have to say that's quite the juggling act. But Romaine, he never suspected anything out of the ordinary, although he did recall that Eugene had referred to his quote former unquote wife from time to time, which he took to mean that his driver was divorced. The reality was that Eugene was not making ends meet. One thing that did come out during this whole mess is that he had attempted to start his own trucking company in Albany, but that only forced him into bankruptcy. And it was right after exiting bankruptcy that he picked up his second family and moved them from Albany to Schaghticoke. The first Mrs. Woods believed that her late husband was making between $200 and $300 per week. That's between $2,400 and $3,600 today. But the main reason that they never had any money was that Eugene was supposedly making expensive payments on a 1951 Buick that he had purchased. Of course, there was no way she could have known that the real reason he was always broke was that he was giving $100 per week, or $1,200 per week today, to his second wife, Jean. It wasn't that Buick that was depleting his finances, it was his second family. Neither woman knew that Eugene had another wife. Jean, who's up in Schaghticoke, told a reporter,
"He never mentioned another marriage and never spoke of another woman. I don't see how he could have deceived anyone. Every holiday he spent with our children."
She noted that.
"Except while truck driving, he never spent any time away from home. He was a fine husband and father."
Anna agreed and said,
"He spent at least 2 days out every week with me in Saugerties. Why, he took me to the movies only one night before the accident."
Of course, one has to wonder how long Eugene, if he hadn't been killed, how long he could have kept up this deception. I mean, at some point, one of his 2 wives was bound to have learned about the other. But now they were both left with rent to pay, and each had 4 hungry mouths to feed. As a result, both wives had no choice but to apply for public assistance. And yes, they both continued to express their desire to sue the man who they felt was responsible for their husband's death. Of course, the simple thing to do would have been for the 2 women to have come to some sort of agreement and file a joint lawsuit against Massel. However, their animosity towards one another made it clear that was never, ever going to happen. Needless to say, this was all one big legal mess. The first matter that needed to be resolved was whether Eugene was a resident of Ulster County, where his first wife Anna lived, or of Rensselaer County, where Jean resided. Well, a check of the 1950 census was of no help. That's because there's one entry for a Eugene H. Wood, a truck driver for a produce company, who was living in Saugerties with his wife Ann and their 4 children. But there's also a second listing for Eugene Wood, a produce truck driver, who was living with his wife and children in Albany. Perhaps the only clues to where Eugene considered his home to be was that he was registered to vote in Albany during the 3 years leading up to his death. That then would imply that he considered his home to be with his second wife, Jean, wherever that would be. He considered that to be his true residence. And since his last home with Jean was in Rensselaer County, maybe that should be taken to be his place of residence. And that's exactly what Jean's lawyer, C. Fred Schwartz Jr., argued in Rensselaer County Surrogate Court. He insisted that since Eugene Wood was a legal resident of Rensselaer County at the time of his death, its courts had jurisdiction in this matter.
He spent all of his work time at Scaticoke, and his boss says he was never a minute late at any checkpoint when he was on the road.
Schwartz did concede that Eugene made brief stops at his first wife's house, but he insisted it was only to leave her money. But Anna Wood's attorney, Max Goldstein, he strongly disagreed. Basically, it didn't matter where Eugene was shacking up. He married Anna first, making her, quote, the sole lawful widow surviving the decedent, unquote. That meant that the marriage between Eugene and Jean was invalid. And since Anna lived in Ulster County, that's where all court proceedings should be held. And 2 months after Eugene's passing on Monday, December 1st of 1952, Judge Donahue in Troy completely revoked the letters of administration that he had issued. If you recall, he had first placed a temporary hold on them. But he made it clear that he was doing so only on the advice of Jean Wood's counsel and that she was still entitled to her day in court. Just why Schwartz would be willing to forfeit his home court advantage, so to speak, is kind of puzzling to me, but I have to say, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what his motives were. What is clear is that all the proceedings were now moved to the Ulster County Surrogate Court. And there, Schwartz challenged Eugene's first wife, Anna, to show cause as to why the letters of administration issued there shouldn't also be revoked. Hearings began on Monday, December 8, 1952, before surrogate John B. Sturley. Both wives did testify, and a few new interesting facts were revealed. First, after Eugene died, 2 different wakes were held for him. Jean arranged for the first one up in Albany, while Anna held one the following night in Saugerties. And here's the crazy part. In addition, both women claimed to have been at Eugene's funeral, yet they supposedly never saw one another. I mean, just how could that be? Jean said that she had first learned that Eugene had been previously married while going through his papers after he died. In them, she found a letter signed by Anna during the war, and it said that she wanted a divorce. Unfortunately, Jean had misplaced the letter, so she was unable to prove her contention in court. It was also revealed that despite being married to Eugene for over 7 years and being the mother to 3 of his children, Jean had never met his parents. She did testify that she had met one of his 3 sisters, but she couldn't recall her name. When questioned, Jean said she had never received Eugene's military family allotment while he was still in the Navy. Later, when Anna was brought to the stand, she confirmed that as the first wife, she was the one receiving those benefits in addition to his discharge pay, and that she had been receiving Social Security benefits ever since. While Jean insisted that she had no knowledge of Anna's existence, Anna testified that on 2 occasions, once in 1947 and again in 1948, she had visited Jean's address on Colony Street in Albany with her parents and sister. Anna explained that she went there after hearing rumors that Eugene was involved with another woman. She told the court,
I told her to leave my husband alone.
But when questioned as to whether or not she had mentioned to Jean that she was Eugene's wife, she replied,
No.
There were some postponements along the way, but concluding arguments were completed on Tuesday, January 6th of 1953. Judge Sturley gave attorney Schwartz, who represented Jean, wife number 2, 10 days to submit memoranda. And after that, Anna's lawyer, Max Goldstein, he had an additional 10 days to submit his arguments. Schwartz's argument was simple. While the marriage between Eugene and Jean may not have been valid, the Domestic Relations Court Act in effect at the time provided that children born of a union that had its basis on a ceremonial marriage, even if that marriage was later nullified, those children were considered legitimate. I should note that this law was intended for children of marriages that ended in divorce or annulment, not because of bigamy. So the question as to whether Judge Sturley would accept Schwartz's argument, well, we'd have to wait and see. On Monday, February 16, 1953, Sturley said that Anna Houck Wood of Saugerties was the one and only widow of Eugene Wood. And as a result, Jean Patricelli Wood and her 3 children, by this time she had lost the child that she was carrying, they were not entitled to any claim on his estate. Jean did appeal the case, and on Tuesday, November 10, 1953, New York State Supreme Court Justice William Deckelman ruled that the Ulster County decision only applied to the 2 wives. Basically, Jean's children weren't party to the proceedings, so therefore they weren't bound to the decision. He wrote,
"The legitimacy or illegitimacy of the Scattercoke children is, in my opinion, a substantial right which could not be decided without giving plaintiffs their day in court. They are entitled to that relief in any event. Whether or not they are entitled to share in the proceeds of the action for wrongful death need not now be determined. That will be for the trial court after a trial of the issues."
Well, that would never happen. That's because a settlement between the families and the insurance company that represented Albert Massot and the perfume company that he worked for, a settlement was reached. In total, the insurance company paid out $62,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $724,000 today. Little side note is that the newspaper, the Albany Times-Union, listed the insurance company as the Liberal Mutual Insurance Company. My hunch is that's supposed to be the Liberty Mutual Insurance Company. $47,000 of that $62,000 was divided up as follows. $1,300 went for funeral and burial expenses. $15,666 went to attorney Goldstein services. $10,010 went to wife Anna Wood, and $5,006 to each of her 4 children, which leaves $15,000 remaining. And that was split equally among each of Jean's 3 children. That $15,000 was deposited in separate accounts at the Troy Savings Bank, and they were withdrawable only on court order. Now, if you're keeping track of all the math, what that means is that Jean, wife number 2, she didn't get a dime. Needless to say, Eugene Wood, the double-life trucker, he left behind not just 1 grieving family, but 2. And of course, a big legal mess to go along with that. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. I first came across Eugene Wood's story many, many years ago, but then I misplaced it. I have to tell you, I was just too disorganized in my early years of recording this podcast, and somewhere it just got lost. But every once in a while, Eugene's story would somehow pop back into my brain, but I could only remember vague details about it. Basically, all I can recall is that he was a truck driver from Menands, and he had 2 families, one of which was down in Saugerties. And I tried searching the newspaper archives for it several times, but I just couldn't find it. What I didn't realize is I was typing in Thruway. The New York State Thruway is the main road that you would take today from Albany to Saugerties. But I wasn't thinking. The Thruway simply didn't exist in 1952, and that's probably why I never found it. Then, about a month ago, I was sorting through this really thick pile of notes I had accumulated over the years, and suddenly I looked down, and there were the factoids that I had jotted down when I first learned of the story. It was maybe 6 or 7 little tidbits, that's about it, but it was enough to start my research. And it's the type of story I've always been attracted to, a long-forgotten, human interest story with a little bit of a surprise or twist to go along with it. And after completing the research, I decided this was definitely going to be my next episode for the podcast. But as I was sorting through my notes about 10 days ago, this strong feeling of exhaustion just swept over me. I needed to go to sleep. And by the next day, I had a slight fever, so I tested myself, and sure enough, I had COVID. It was never anything too serious, but it did set the release of this episode back by about a week. And except for some stuffiness, I actually feel pretty good right now. Anyway, because I'm so stuffy, I'm not going to say any more. Just a reminder that the Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So be sure to visit airwavemedia.com where you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Anyways, as always, thanks for listening and take care, everyone. Bye.